So Wadawurrung, how are you and hello? I'm Carol McGregor and I'm an artist of Wadawurrung and Scottish descent and also the Program Director of the Contemporary Australian Indigenous Art, or KIA as we call it, at Griffith University's Queensland College of Art. As we begin, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're recording this discussion on Meanjin, named Brisbane, and we acknowledge the Yagara and the Turrbal peoples. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians who keep the law of the land, of the various lands on which you are all on today. And we acknowledge that these have always been sites of education and learning. We pay our respects to the communities, their elders past and present, and also their upcoming leaders, and celebrate the diversity of First Nations peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters and skies.
Thank you, Carol. And hello, and on behalf of Griffith University Art Museum, I also want to extend our welcome and thank you very much for joining us at our special event today. My name's Naomi Evans and I'm a co-curator of source materials with Carol McGregor. I have got Dutch, Welsh, English, and I've just recently found out Jewish heritage, and originally from Darramurrugal country in Sydney and moved to Meanjin some 10 years ago. We were so delighted to welcome all of you today to speak and use our exhibition as a kind of a jumping off point. Some of the conversations I know that we will share an interest in. We all work in an institution which is a place of learning, and in academia, I quote Australian philosopher Michelle Bullis Walker's book, which is Slow Philosophy, Reading Against the Institution, where she talks about this dichotomy between what we do as creative people and as thinkers and what the institution sometimes requires of us. And this impulse to find a forensic desire to know, which is sometimes incommensurate with the mystery art offers. And so with these ideas in mind, I'm really privileged to hand over to Carol to facilitate this yarning circle today. And I'm just so thrilled that we can all hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. So when you and I, or Naomi and I, began our many yarns that culminated in the exhibition Source Materials, we saw in the artists' works the expression of cultural continuums through their materiality and their decision to work in transcultural art forms. So as we are all embedded in knowledge systems that sometimes overlap, sometimes they are parallel or seemingly in opposition, we identified in artists' works a connecting of their cultural lives, their self-expression through art, and a sense of letting go of the constrictive and simplistic thinking that sometimes surround art theory. So rather, culture is dynamic and there's a fluidity that it is embraced, and as we move forward with our own knowledges. So in Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, Tyson Yunkaporta writes, "We don't have a word for non-linear in our languages because nobody would consider travelling, thinking or talking in a straight path in the first place. The winding path is just how a path is and therefore needs no name." So because of Tyson's thinking inspired us, we felt it would be incredible to hear from him, thank you Tyson, and other local artists speak to their notions of source materials. So I'm really grateful to introduce our panel. Firstly, Tyson Yunkaporta. He's an academic, an arts critic and a researcher who is a member of the Apalech clan from far north Queensland. He carves traditional tools and weapons and also works as a senior lecturer in Indigenous knowledges at Deakin University in Melbourne. Then we have Warraba Weatherall. He's an artist, curator and academic from Kamilaroi Nation of southwest Queensland. Informed by his cultural heritage, Warraba's practice aims to critique colonisation as an ongoing process in Australia. In referencing Indigenous knowledges, Warraba presents alternate ways of seeing and understanding to contribute to a cross-cultural dialogue and reassert cultural pride. And also Libby Harward is joining us. She's a Quandamooka artist of Moreton Bay region in Queensland and a descendant of the Ngugi people from Mulgumpin, Moreton Island. Libby creates artworks that break through the colonial overlay to connect with the cultural landscape, which always was and always will be here. Libby describes her practice as a process of simultaneously listening, calling out and knowing and understanding country. Libby has also recently co-founded Munumbaja, a welcome place, with her partner Jinnaburra man BJ Murphy. Munumbaja is a contemporary First Nations culture space, a yarning place, a contemporary gallery and a gallery shop on Jinnaburra country in Maleny, Queensland. So after those lengthy introductions, I just want to reflect on the non-linear pathways that Tyson talks about and the expression of cultural continuums through materiality. Each of you are working in this space and in complex transcultural processes or art forms. And I thought you might be able to share a little bit about this. So Tyson, firstly, we're familiar with your words in transformational processes or ways of learning, the way of holding and sharing knowledge through thinking, making, thinking more and yarning. And writing down in English may have been a constraint, but Sand Talk has given many people access to and value to other or Aboriginal ways and processes to knowledge. Would you be able to talk a little bit about this, these processes of the knowledge system and also about your writing and your making with us?
First of all, it can't save the world. We're all stuffed, by the way. But and second of all, I guess that little quote you did, that non-linear one, you know, that's not my knowledge, and I guess that's how we work in our way. It's, you know, I mean, you do own your story, but I didn't really share my stuff, my Bronco dreaming stuff in the book, because I mean, that's mine. Like, but yeah, but lots of story from all over. Actually, that bit you read out, that's from Warraba, that's from your mob. That one, I learned that from that Wamba Star story, and also that bit from that big Bayami songline out there. The part where he's following the honeybee. It's that one, you know, as well. So that's where all that really came together for me, was talking to them old fellas out there. And, you know, big sing out to old fella George Rose, passed away too. Is a lot of that stuff he was passing on to me in his cheeky way. He appreciated my cheekiness too, which not everybody does. But, you know, that's this, I guess there's this kind of translation thing that goes on, and figuring out how to get these ideas across in ways that are going to be fun, interesting, but kind of have that impact, you know, and be, you know, like a poem is kind of sneaky, cheeky. It doesn't quite say the thing, and then it ducks around the side and hooks you in the jaw, you know, in a way that you feel okay about that. Yeah, so I guess that's the trick. Yeah, and a shout out to Wadawurrung country too, by the way. I'll acknowledge that because that's where my campus is located, right there, and that's where we're running out of there, the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab, you know, which is people from, you know, different groups, different language groups all over, coming together in embassy. We're using that, we're working with protocols from Queensland, actually, the Bunya Mountains, that big gathering they have every 3 years there since forever. And we're working with those protocols of embassy as a methodology to direct all our inquiry from our different language groups and worldviews. Yeah, which we direct outwards. So we use our traditional methods of inquiry to examine the world, to look outwards and try and solve some of the big, stickier, complex problems of the world. So we do that from there, and that's always multimodal. We're always we engage in more research translation than just research papers, publishing research papers. So we do that, but we're constantly doing research translation all the way through, in all kinds of different ways, like through art and all kinds of things. Yeah. So how did you want me to go on for a bit, or
yeah, and
are we going to switch around?
Yeah, we can switch around because we can talk about the image that we've got on the screen right now, or we can throw to Libby if you want to talk about. But I think we can talk about the image you've got on your screen and then go to Libby.
I mean, that's a good example. So so that was in an exhibition here in Melbourne. Yeah, so that piece was called First Law, and so that's a stick, actually, once again, from a bit of mulga from out your way there, bros. And yeah, so this one's about it sort of contains all this knowledge about the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Yeah, so that so this idea of first law, sort of, I don't know, there's a pun there for, first law, like of first peoples, and then that second law is, of the second peoples, like the occupying culture, So, but it's also, about physics. So in that first law, all your systems are kind of open and interconnected, and they have like these closed feedback loops where they're constantly exchanging entropy, so that there's one system's entropy is another system's lunch. Everything's kind of recycled, and you don't lose, energy and resources from the system. It's sustainable in that way. So yeah, that's kind of, I don't know, a nutshell, simplified version of the first law of thermodynamics. But the second law is this theoretical idea of a closed system, which is actually impossible in this reality to do. But so closed systems like a vacuum, completely enclosed where nothing can escape. And the idea is that in a vacuum, a closed system, complexity will break down in there over time. And that this is what creates the arrow of time, what they call in physics. So this is the reason time runs forward, is because of the second law of thermodynamics. So I was trying to model an indigenous physics, an indigenous model of time, in dialogue with that with Western physics, contemporary physics. I shouldn't call it Western because everybody's contributed to that. I don't know why Western people claim science all the time. It belongs to everybody. Yeah. So anyway, you can't see the whole thing there, but it's so it's part of a big circle of clay on the floor, and the stick gets rolled around that big circle of clay, and it leaves an imprint. So I was thinking, when I was thinking about that idea of a closed system, I was thinking about the European conception, the European dreaming of the Ouroboros from the Northern Hemisphere, the snake eating its tail. And that in the Northern Hemisphere, they call that a symbol of infinity. But we look at the same thing here and we go, that's not infinity. He's just going to eat himself. Is he going to finish up an end with just an inside out head or something? That's not going to last forever. That snake's going to die. Yeah, so I was thinking about that rainbow snake, and there's a lot of the stuff from the Great Dividing Range there, going up along. And of course, that Great Dividing Range doesn't divide anything, it binds it together. And that runs past your country there, Libby, too, parallel with that big carpet snake one going all the way up there as well, that you would know really well. So I mentioned it. Yeah, so there's all that kind of stuff in there. But the idea was that if I put him around the stick, so it looks like almost kind of like the Ouroboros, but the 3D, because it's a 3D object, it reveals something else about the nature of time from an indigenous perspective of physics, from indigenous physics in our IK systems. And that's revealed when you roll it out on the clay. So it's rolling out on a big circle. And what you end up with is not a snake eating its tail, but an endless line of serpents from, in procession, from nose to tail, just infinitely. And it goes all the way around the circle. The hard part was making it so that the last snake's nose would line up with the first snake's tail, but it worked out exactly right the first time. Yeah, and so that just goes around in a circle, and it's forever, it's eternal. It just keeps coming around. So that's trying to get across, translate an Indigenous notion of physics, while also giving people a different notion of time, and that, in our way, time and place are the same. Time and place are the same thing. So Butterman, in your language, it's a suffix that goes on the end of a word, and it's the same for time and for place, So usually in our languages, there's no separate words or indicators of time or place. They're one thing, which is pretty cool for the whole time-space business. So that one wound out, and you end up with it like it was kind of like the hand of a clock, but also like the arrow of a compass, in the middle of a circle, to sort of give that idea of time and place being one thing. And so that's that's how all that sort of stuff works. You can't really separate scholarship and knowledge and art. And kind of, we could talk about it more later, but I mean, there isn't a word in any of our languages for art, because we don't have that abstract noun sort of separating it as an industry or a discipline. It's just those practices. Everybody does that, and it's just part of your everyday life. It's about how you make collective meaning making together, as in stuff that's now called art and performance, and has to be made rare and limitable and excludable in order to be priced as somebody else's capital. But we can get into that later if you like.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson. It's the first time visually that an Indigenous way of physics and thinking has been put like this. It's just incredible to think about that. And when you talk about the infinity is actually a different infinity than what Western science sees them eating themselves. Yeah. Thank you for that. But I think that what you said is we had no word for art. Libby, your practice really speaks to that, and what Tyson was saying in the end there. If you would like to say some things about your practice and following on from that.
Well, so many things. Firstly, I'm on Ngunnawal country, which is bordering Kabi country. Kabi is the language group actually, and Ngunnawal is like you're saying, like a governance structure that crosses several different languages. That's my husband BJ's country, who's around here in a bit. But I had my laptop before. I would really like to take you all out the front and show you the amazing abundance of Bunya that I
have
at the moment.
I've got some coming in the mail.
And
they send me some in the mail.
Great. And I've come from Yugambeh, Kumbameri country, and I've only been up here this year sharing my partner's first time living full time on his country, and just the amount of knowledge and just being here for this big abundant Bunya season is amazing. And it's so awesome because so many mobs came here, and learning about governance just by being around on this country, I feel really privileged at the moment. And just looking at your work, Tyson, just then, because I'm not an academic. I am currently doing my master's. I haven't studied for a lot of years in the university system, and it was a bit of a shock to be back in there. Good ways and really hard and frustrating as well. But looking at your work, I loved how the carved mulga and its relationship with the clay. And I get really frustrated a lot how hard it is for us within Western systems to just escape the objectification of everything. And every time we make an object or put it somewhere, it's always in relationship with the colonial gaze, which can be really good as an artist, but also really heartbreaking at times. And so just to see, like I saw you holding that object, but then to see it in relationship with that clay, it really, it spoke to what I was doing with my work, because all of a sudden I was doing a master's and we had this thing called a critique. And my peers, which was Carol and Warraba, who couldn't actually make it, and it ended up being Di and another peer called Dom, where I was in some sort of relationship with them that was based on them critiquing an artwork that I was in the making of. And I guess that I'm talking about that because that's what's in front of us now, part of that process, but that's a really uncomfortable position to be in. And I also was noticing we are continually living and breathing our culture, our relationships, our connections, but within institutions, it's still really the light or the vision or the gaze quite often isn't on the most important parts of what we're doing. It becomes on these objects that we're creating and positioning in space, which I reckon we do pretty damn well, and we're all really clever at it. But there's points where I've just had enough of that. And I'm thinking we know we have these relationships with each other, and we know what's the most important thing about our knowledge sharing and our relationships and our connections. But I still think at times we struggle to, what I do, I can't speak for everyone else, I struggle to stop being like in a performance or in an objectified space as an artist. And that's okay, because I can take that power and use that. Like when I was listening to your Carol introduced you, Warraba, I think that's really true. You do that really well, and that's what you do. But the bit that's angry inside of me, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to do that. And where are the spaces where we're not doing that, particularly in these urban environments and institutional environments? So I don't know, this yarn is kind of good. Like, to me, it's about us getting together to yarn. And one of the ways that I believe we're colonized too much is through our time. Our time is in time of being together. It gets pulled into spaces that aren't about us just sharing as Black fellas together. And so this work that is kind of, I've got some pictures of here, was really just my way of using my life and what was going on in my life, sharing Yinabara country with my partner and moving between Quandamooka, which is really close country, and our people moved back and forth in this place, and living down the road from Dom, who's another Kamilaroi artist, whose people, Warraba's people, all came here as well, to like all come together in a space and call it art. And so this, what you're looking at now, is bangwall, which is one that we would use to make, our Quandamooka people would use to make flour. And I hadn't done it before, so I utilised the time that I had back on country where I was like kind of expected to make art, I guess, to just explore what this flour fibre, I think it's like a starch, is like to hold, to dig. I dug it up with my daughter. I felt the earth that I had recently been burned, and got a feeling and understanding of what happens to that bungwall after it's re-shooted out of burnt country. And then I brought it back here to Bunya country, and I worked with the Bunya and ground it into flour and I started mixing it together. And then I shared that experience with Carol and Di, and we called it art. So I guess there's so many other things I could say about that, but it felt like it just came out of a place of struggle, which probably isn't fair, but it just felt really hard to assert this relational practice as art and avoid being critiqued, I guess, in a way that made it, I don't know really what the term is, but when we're looked upon as, is it ethnographic, or is that the right term, Carol?
Being observed, yeah, ethnographic, yeah.
That's present in the space because we all live in the colony, right? But I just documented after. I didn't document the actual work. Didactics played a really big place in the work, which is interesting in itself, but I feel like that was my means of invitation into it as asserting it as a piece of art. And some of the things that probably were the most important to me was about permission and acceptance. So like, and I allowed the critiquers to be critiquers in the space, whereas that was just assumed. From the start, it was assumed that relationship would be the relationship, and I wasn't okay with that. That needed to be something that I asserted as okay. And I also asked for permission for the critiquers to become the artwork. So we all sat inside the work, which is probably what the intention behind having the didactics was. But yeah, I think that what I essentially was looking at in that work, it's quite different from other works that I've done in the past, is just about what we're sitting inside and how we continue to accept stuff that we don't have to keep accepting. And maybe if everything is already there, it's just that sometimes we're aware of it, but we're still making objects or things that are sitting in a space that's not essentially for us or with our permission or about our relationship to each other and country.
Yeah, now just being there, can I just add, Libby, too, that we had a lot of reflection and yarning in that space. We made bunya nut little dampers as well as with the bungle wallflower, and it took us away from our rush of everyday institutionalised lives, but also we sat and breathed in that space. You allowed us to do that culturally, and I think that was part of that was the art too, was us just reflecting and not going anywhere. We didn't need to actually critique. We didn't need to say anything. It was any yarn that came up because of what you had offered. And you allowed us that space too in our lives. And I really thank you for that. And also it made me think, as you say, the objects that we make for what? For the gaze or for that exhibition or for this. But then again, when I make objects, it's a story that comes out from me and I don't really care what it ends up with, because it's more like Tyson's work. I think it's more about trying to get that object to tell that story and working with those materials and your hands and your thinking. And I find that guides my making process more than thinking about how it's going to be in an exhibition. Maybe that's why all my work's ephemeral or it doesn't last or anything, because I don't really care about that. And I think that's something, Warraba, I'd love to hear from you. And we've got a few images of your work as well, and some of your carvings. And I think we've got a few works that you'd like to talk about, and how I think that what we're talking about seems to be very similar, but in slightly different ways. And I see that we hold that story, but we're holding different pieces of the story. So, Warraba, if you can just tell us a little bit more about what you're doing here, because I'd love to learn more. I think we all will.
Yeah, I think, can everyone hear me? Yeah. So I think, well, I just wanted to riff off the conversations that Tyson and Libby were having. I was just thinking halfway through I wanted to butt in and say stuff, but I thought I'd wait. But, you know, just in as far as, you know, the different perspectives of time and I guess our own cultural obligations and worldviews and how at times they can be, you know, diametrically different to, you know, something that is not grounded within this country, other worldviews. And so I think I'll start with this one. So this particular one was a carving that I did for a series of message sticks that were gifted to a whole region of clan groups that we passed through their country when we were bringing ancestors back home to lay them to rest. And they came from my father and a bunch of other people who have been working towards this for 30 to 40 years and getting our ancestors home from institutions around the world, but also in Australia. Something that was by our protocols and engaging with those other neighbouring groups, and then also meeting them as we were guided through their country, but also gifting these as a thanks and acknowledging that collaboration just by travelling through their country and giving us you know, safe passage. And so that was the intention behind the work. It was very direct and very literal, and part of a process that we had to uphold to get those people back. Funnily enough, I was racing to try and get some images for this talk, and because one of them actually got gifted to the Queensland Museum as a reciprocal thing. One of the women there, Leonie Coghill, has been instrumental in repatriation efforts right around Queensland, and so we gave that to Leonie on behalf of the Queensland Museum. And funnily enough, I was trying to find an image on my computer, but I couldn't. And then it was on the website, and then I was, you know, it wasn't necessarily a negative thing, but it's just funny how things can just turn up in places where you don't expect them to, you know. So I guess with the work that has a direct cultural lineage, but also the nature of why materials are kept within museum clearinghouses and institutions is more to the question and more to the crux of what my practice does and critiquing those things. And so if we go to the next image, probably be able to flush that a bit more. I was hoping it could have been the other one. This one. So when Tyson was talking around the difference between knowledges and not to just get trapped into Western knowledge, because that's something that we all contribute to. One of the things that I did within this project was creating a database of collections all around Australia that possess Kamilaroi cultural materials, and then printing them onto memorial plaques, intentionally using the same semiotics, the same format, the same sequences as the institution, because the institutional perspective of it is what I'm killing, is what is being decimated, is what should be laid to rest, and not our cultural perspectives of those materials. So that was the first thing to be clear on. But I did not change any of the information on the index cards, and they're all real, all from real collections, and some of them are a lot more shocking than others, as I'm sure everyone can imagine. But the problem that I was getting to with, Libby was talking about performing, and getting fit into a box. What are these expectations? And a lot of the time, these simplistic ideas of what culture is, or how to interpret that culture, how to engage with that culture, especially with people outside of that culture. And one of the things that I come back to all the time is how institutions, specifically museums, have disciplined cultural knowledge and the formats that a lot of the time, without even knowing, people subscribe to that and adopt it. Other times, it can just be brutally devastating to cultural identities, where it sets the precedence of how people think and understand about us and our cultural practices and knowledges. And the problem with that is taxonomy. When we're getting to biological sciences, whether we're actually sitting in an art gallery and we're pigeonholing people into contemporary practice, community practice, all of these overarching signifiers that are helpful to identify, a context, but those contexts that they identify become so locked in that they're very damaging and restricting. And I think that's the primary difference between a scientific line of thought and something that's more in line with the cultural line of thought, where that's not saying that we don't have a cultural taxonomy in some ways, that you could draw a parallel, but they have multiple meanings and variations depending on the context. Whereas within the English language, or with something that is more geared towards scientific discovery, it's very analytical, it's very direct, and it's one way. So for me, the distinction of taxonomy and how we can use that as something to describe various situations, I think that is for me at least helpful to be able to understand the hurdles, but also the cultural complexities that there's similarities, but how they change as well.
Yeah, thanks, Warraba. Yeah, and really agree. And when you were talking, I thought about, and same with you, Libby and Tyson, about quite often, and we've discussed that we talked about being an oral culture, and we have a lot of visual objects, but it's a relational meta language. I think I read that as well. And we have dance and ceremony, objects, symbols, songland, water and sky knowledges. And I think it's how do we share the process of that knowledge? As you talked about the simplicity of those labels on our objects, those ethnographic gazes that just recorded in their own way of thinking and didn't include anything that was our relational ways. How do we share that so that people understand?
Well, it's so extractive, and the word that pops there for me is acquired. And that really speaks to what Libby's story before. She was trying to express that, how she feels, and really she's being acquired. The things that we make, etc., they have a spirit in us, and they're traditionally part of an economic system that it's not even give and take, it's just give, like that ngapachi that you get from Central Desert, how they say it. It's just like these objects, that stick has got to, I just haven't been able to travel for a couple of years because of COVID, but that stick's got to go back where it came from now. you know, and where a lot of the knowledge that impacted that, you know, that's got to go back to those old people there, but on your country there, it's got to go back there and sit with them. So, you know, in our economy, it's about, you know, we make these things in order to pass them on, not to be mediated through some tokens or, you know, something like that. So for me, I always try and, like, I never sell anything. I try and keep it in our traditional economy, but that's just because I don't have to, because I have a job that makes me enough money to eat and be sheltered, you know, not to like own a house or anything, but enough to be sheltered. So that's fine. So yeah, so I always circulate these things back, you know, into our traditional economy through the community that way. And that keeps me sane and helps me evade that whole acquisition thing. Unless I give it to my dad, which he immediately goes and bloody sells it to the police. Police, mind you. Police for like a 6-pack or something.
Yeah.
Well, what kind of policing is that? God, I made a boomerang bigger than me once, and he gave it to a policeman for six beers.
There's always a price on
God. Anyway, that's that's how he interacts across between our economies, I guess. Yeah.
Carol, like, I think we do it all the time, and just thinking with our own mob, I feel like we are always, I can't remember the words you used, but we are always engaging in our own economy and in our own relationships. And when we do things we're always in the colony, but when we are creating art within that space, all of us here are doing that intentionally, and we know what we're doing. But I feel like I want to create more space for our mob to have the choices to do that, because like Tyson said, you know, there are some of our families and mob that are still feel trapped to have to create that work or position it to be sold to people, and not from an authentic space of their culture. And I think creating more space for that, and shifting, that's what I mean by kind of shifting the lens away to really speak to what we're already doing all the time in being cultural people.
Yeah, definitely. I reckon there's also that overlap of what that actually looks like as well, and that, you know, there's so many different experiences of culture, of colonization, and for people who don't have a accessible point within their family to you know, receive a lot of knowledge in a cultural sense, and also balancing that with you know, that contemporary political knowledge is also cultural. Like we've gotten to a point where culture is politicized, but politics is culture, and it just sort of works off each other. That there's nothing that's not culture, because and that's actually part of the problem, is that you know, by the 80s, within you know, anthropology and things like this, is that non-white cultures were just dubbed different cultures, and that was cultural. But then again, there was no European culture, because that was the norm. That's normative. And so, looking at the different experiences and seeing them all as valid. And one thing that I come across more often is that it's not necessarily the aesthetic that's the cultural part, but it's the framework, or it's the process. It's the things that are the underpinning values that support why we're doing that. What's the purpose and reason? And those things are really interesting. And even if they're fragmentary, that it gives enough of an idea to it that, and also mirroring it off each other as our practices and our neighbours, our nation's neighbours, that we can build those relationships to then see what the differences are by contrast, and also see what those similarities are, because a lot of the time, just like dialects, there's very similar nuances between neighbouring groups, and especially, regionally, ones that have the same, kinship systems and things like that. So I think that for people, could be helpful for people to sort of see the fluidity of it, but also that there's not kind of one way, and there's so many layers that can actually build up to that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Warraba, just with those so many different layers, and that was traditional too. There were so many different layers always going on at the same time, and it didn't mean you had to understand that layer, as long as you were confident and you shared with what you were taught and your knowledge. And I think about all our practices and those, it just brought to mind those relationships of integrity that you all hold, Tyson, with, your gifting of the objects that you make and taking back to elders and making sure they're appropriately used. And Warraba, just even with that reciprocal gifts with the museums and with other institutions. And then Libby, just in the space that you're doing at the moment in your gallery space, making a community space in an area that's never had an Aboriginal gallery before on Yunnaburra country. And then I always think about I do a lot of possum skin workshops, teaching mob how to make cloaks, Tyson. And I think about that, and I'm off to do one for a few days very shortly with community. And after I leave, always think, I hope I've helped. And it's always the process. It's never about the cloak. It's always about sitting and yarning and making and doing at the same time. And not only passing on the skills, but, it's just about the moment that you share with people, that you're connecting little threads, which I feel that the three of you, and myself included, hopefully, are all doing in that space. And sometimes we get very isolated, not only as artists, but as academics in an institution. And I have to say, it's so lovely to share this yarn with you. And that's all I know everyone's saying, what are we going to talk about? Yeah, we'll just find it, And that's what I love about yarning, is because when you get different minds doing the same sort of, almost the parallel things, but holding different spaces in those things we're talking about, it just works. Yeah.
We may not have abstract nouns for things like art, in a lot of our languages, but there's usually a noun. There's usually a term for collective sense making, with most mobs. And I know there is it's so great that it's Bunya season now, because so John Davis is a senior fellow in our lab. And so he brings all those protocols of Bunya ones. So we build our think tank kind of activities that way. And so one of the big ones we follow is this concept of wanju. And wanju is that's from there, and it's that term that means collective sense making, and that's the thing. You can't do it individually with your research. It is collective, because it's everybody's point of view comes to the table, and that's how it happens. But they make art in the West a solitary practice. There's a reason for that. It'll take me like a minute and a half to get there. We got time?
Yeah.
I'll have to come around the side. So my mate Ben Moody, he's a comedian. And he tells this joke like, what's the difference between Hey, Moody's. I seen him the other day. I ran into him here. All the mobs our kids were playing together was deadly. I hadn't seen him for so long. Haven't been out of the freaking house in 2 years. Yeah. Anyway, he goes, what's the difference between the first fleet and a bottle of milk? After 200 years, the bottle of milk could have some culture. It's not really an insult to this colony in particular. It's just a feature of hegemony, in these empires. The closer you are to the center of power and the center of the occupying culture, there's nothing there. It's not a generative place. It doesn't generate culture. So they have to mine culture from the margins. So they come out and find us there, and they mine that, they extract it from the margins there. But at the same time, they can't be elevating us above their own artists. So they have to make art such an isolating and marginalizing practice that it drives artists insane. All these solitary little, that Brett White, his name, that one that desecrated that site there out your way, Brad. They just go nuts and cut off their ear and send it to their girlfriend because they're in this solitary practice that's so demanding of them and demands that they go deep and find this dark side and bloody this Jungian horror underworld conscious. They're always looking inside like they're going to find themselves in there. And I'm like, nah, bros, that's not where you are. Stop doing personal development. Stop looking inward. Stop examining yourself. Stop trying to find your sin and your things to fix up and relentlessly self-improve. That's not where you are. You're out there. Your neural processes, your everything. It's in your relationships. It's in that spaces in between you and the humans and non-humans you're in relation to. Buddy, you got that freshwater turtle and you're in that relation with that. And then all of the things that are around paired to that in that same system, and you're connected in that way. And all your knowledge sits there. It's not inside some fabulous brain that you're going to dig deep and pull out some art for somebody. It's external, but they drive these artists inwards on their own, out of relation, and they just lose their freaking mind. And so then they then, as mentally ill people, they then become marginal. They still belong to the center, but they become marginal enough to produce the great works of art of that civilization. But art is always, without exception, mined from the margins because the center cannot produce it. It does not have any creation. And the center is about destruction, acquisition. It's a closed system. It's entropic. It's death. And so off we go. And that's who we have to interact with and try and build a livelihood while the things we make become somebody else's capital. Because that's what art is for as an industry. It's just money laundering. It's a place for oligarchs to park their cash. Because you're rich in Europe, traditionally, what they do to make their wealth sustainable is they park it in three places: in land, because land's capital now too. That didn't happen long ago. That's only like a few hundred years it's been like that. So land became capital, they park it there. So that's why we're in trouble with all this real estate and global financial crisis, etc. Then there's precious metals, they park it there. And in art, so all your great families, they survive like 2 world wars, all kinds of invasions. They survive that because they have all their capital parked in places like that. So we're there to create capital for these people, for these oligarchs to launder and store their wealth. Somehow you got to disrupt that because you can't be like one of these ones, I'm decolonizing. I'm freaking decolonizing on the coffee. It's a hard road. You got to get there and get a bit dirty.
I think some of some of the solution in there, or something to actually at least balance it a bit, is knowing how that system functions, like you were saying. But also that we all look to scientific disciplines as like the polar opposite of what our culture is. And well, I love science, but it's I guess the science that has negatively impacted different cultures around the world is the thing which I'm talking about, and drawing that to the art world, where the natural sciences and philosophies used to be the same thing, and then the separation of the natural sciences then went off to the museums, and the philosophies then became their own branch and then got more associated with the artists. And so within a Western ideal of those things, they are very much the same because they were the same historically. And so those things are not the same principles as what we use culturally to make art, to communicate, to document, to do things ceremonially. And when you were talking about language before, it made me think of our term winanga, which is to know, to remember, to understand. Some people even use it for love, but you know, I think it's a bit more of a looser interpretation. But it 4 to 5 different meanings of the one word, and I feel like that even in itself as a metaphor for what our practices look like within a cultural sense, they can be understanding, they can be remembering, they can be this, and how they actually manifest within a practice is so different. And so that cultural terms of reference of it can be so many things, but on the surface just look like something, is very different from, say, the ideals of abstraction or minimalism. And it has to be, there's a set terms of reference that you don't stray too much from, but it's encouraged just to stray just a little. Yeah.
And that term, as within most of our languages, you know, around thinking, knowing, you know, cognition, all of these terms are all usually associated also with listening, because it also means that,
Yep.
you know, and it's but it's not like they're all different meanings. It's the one thing, because that's what listening is. You know, you don't think on your own. You know, you think in communion with the others that you're in relation with. And that's it, you know, and that's why it's also loving, you know, because you make that one big belly and you think that way.
We've got ganga, which is to call out and listen. Gangalanji is to call out, listen, and think at all at the same time. It's like the communion, the calling out too.
Yeah, the call out and response.
And Tyson, you were talking before about culture, and the exhibition behind this door is called Bunya Living Culture, and we've got a Bunya fermentation happening out there with a lot of inhabitants creating art that we're going to sit around and watch.
Yeah. Oh, those Bunya geometries are, there's a lot in it. Yeah, there's a lot in it. I tell you, all the governance is right there. You know, but that might be a conversation for another time, because that's a good hour getting into that one.
It'd be good to actually continue this separately, because we've touched on so many things, and we haven't even done cultural-based theory. So, but we will have to close soon.
Yeah.
And I just want to know if there's any last little bits just to tie up what we've discussed and yarned about. For me, I've just taken on so many deep thoughts today. I think that each of you just talked the same sort of meta language, but in different, made me think in different ways. I think that the physics really with your new work, Tyson, I'm really going to take that on board and think about that, and just think about that object moving and imprinting into the clay, and how he made the circle, and that it exactly matched, you know, the tail to the nose. There was no gap. The circle was perfect from the start. There was nothing. And I just got to think about that a little bit more.
Yeah.
For sharing
that.
Well,
some more thought on that. It's just with image, you know, image and spirit are the same thing. You know, often in our languages as well. And so an image of something contains part of its spirit. You know, so Butterman, you do like a carving of a freshwater turtle. You know, totemically, that's going to carry a lot of power because you made it. You know, and if you bring that out once a year for ceremony or something, you know, it has that power. But you know, you sell it to a gallery and it gets photographed. Someone keeps that, or you make like 20 of them. Then it takes that spirit away from it to the point where it becomes a weak object. And it's the same with this stick. It's got no power in it now. Like when I first made it, it was I couldn't even let my kids come anywhere near it because it would make them sick, you know. That's how much power it had. And then, but, you know, in exhibiting it, and it was photographed that many times, by the time I got it back, there's nothing in it. It's finished. And that happens to us all the time. Internet, Facebook, you know, our images are being replicated infinitely in that shadow world of cyberspace. All of us are getting drained that way. So it's something to think about as well. But yeah, it's a tricky thing to do, make an image with your culture and find it that spirit going in that way.
Right. I think we might even just close our yarn with that. I was going to do a little quote, but I don't think it's necessary. Thank you, Tyson, for sharing your wisdom. It's been an honour to have you. And thank you, Libby, and thank you, Warraba, for also just yarning. And yeah, I think everyone who watches this will learn a lot. I know I have. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.